All right. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Dutch Republic. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this unit is kind of split in half. So the first part of the unit is devoted to absolutism, which was sort of the dominant political form in Europe during this time. And we looked at what that was. We looked at some examples of it. And I mentioned that some states offered an alternative to absolutism, and they took different forms. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Dutch Republic. Next lecture, we're going to look at the English, who become a constitutional monarchy. Now, the Dutch Republic and England have different forms of government during this time, but they're both alternatives to absolutism. So we'll compare all three of these models as we go through. We're also today going to look at why this period in Dutch history was so special and why we call it the Dutch Golden Age. All right. So first of all, well, let's explain what the heck is a republic. So you might be familiar with this term already because the United States is a republic, but a republic is a form of government in which elected representatives make laws for the people whom they represent. So for example, the United States, right, we elect our members of Congress. They go on to make laws that are supposedly in our benefit, right? So this is the kind of government that the Dutch had during the 17th century as well. Now, we call this period the Dutch Golden Age because it was a time period of economic prosperity, intellectual and religious freedom, and it was also a time period when arts and culture really flowered in the Dutch Republic. So it's actually a little bit like Renaissance Italy. So what made the Dutch Republic so special? Well, again, just the fact that it's providing an alternative to absolutism, that makes it pretty unique. Its economic prosperity makes it unique. Its practice of relative religious toleration made it unique because the Dutch Republic was pretty unique in that it tolerated not just other forms of Christianity, but it's also going to tolerate Jewish people, as we'll see, which is very unique in Europe during this time period. And then again, as I mentioned, it was this golden age of arts and culture and philosophy. Again, kind of like Renaissance Italy. All right. Now, before we get into all of that, we need to do a little bit of contextualization here. So let's talk the political history of the Dutch Republic and how it became a republic. So first of all, we're going to go all the way back to last unit and sort of start in the 1500s when the Dutch were actually under the control of Spain. Now, during the Reformation, the Dutch actually become Protestant. They become Calvinist, and Spain, as we know, is Catholic. So that's going to lead to a lot of conflict there. So in the mid-1500s, the Dutch actually revolted against Spain, but they weren't able to become fully independent with that first revolt. So during the Dutch revolt, the Dutch are actually going to split into two. So the southern Dutch provinces remain under the control of Spain, and the northern ones form what is called or what will become the Dutch Republic. Now, they're sort of semi-independent, those northern provinces, from the mid-1500s on, and they become fully independent with the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. So that's where we are now. So these northern provinces, there were 7 of them, and they formed almost kind of like the United States, actually. They formed kind of like this federal system. So it's 7 provinces, they're united into republic, just like we have 50 states that are united into one republic as well. Now, each province in the Dutch Republic was governed by a regent, and this is sort of like our governor, right? So each of our 50 states has a governor. And they're sort of like the executive of this state, right? Now, in the Dutch Republic, each province also had what was called a stadtholder, and that's kind of like a congressperson because these people represented the interests of their province in the States General, which was kind of like the legislature. Now, the stadtholder is a little bit different from a congressperson because they also had kind of a military responsibility. They were responsible for their province's military defense as well as maintaining order within that province. So it's not quite the same as what we have today in Congress. Now, moving on to the States General, as I mentioned, kind of like our Congress, they were responsible for carrying out both foreign policy and domestic policy, so making policies that benefited the entire Dutch Republic, so each and every province. Now, I'm talking about the Dutch Republic like it was kind of a foregone conclusion that they would become a republic, but that's actually not the case. So when they first became independent, there was actually kind of like this constant tug of war between the folks who wanted a republican form of government and the folks who wanted a monarchy. And these people who wanted a monarchy, they're actually part of this family or backers of this family called the House of Orange. So the House of Orange wanted to establish this dynasty in the Dutch Republic, kind of like the Hohenzollerns in Prussia or the Habsburgs in the former Holy Roman Empire, right? So that's kind of what they wanted. So the House of Orange actually had quite a bit of support because they actually helped Spain, or not Spain, rather, the Dutch out quite a lot during the revolt against Spain. So they had a lot of legitimacy, they had a lot of support, and their backers were called either Orangists or Royalists. Now, the House of Orange in the late 1600s actually was able for a brief period of time to gain control of the government and make the country a monarchy, but it didn't last too long because, well, the king died without an heir. So rather than launch the country into a succession crisis, the Dutch Republic kind of just went back to being a republic. So they already had that system to fall back on. All right, so that's the political history. Let's talk the economic history of the Dutch Republic. We've actually already talked about this a little bit. We mentioned back during the exploration part of our first unit that the Dutch were really sort of leaders in trade along with the English after the Spanish and the Portuguese lost that power, right? And we also talked about how one of the sort of like it wasn't just the Dutch government leading trade, right? It was also joint stock companies like the Dutch East India Company, right, that was leading trade. Now, they did a lot of luxury trade, so they exported diamonds and textiles and pottery and spices and luxury goods, and they were really dominant in Asian trade. They did play a role in Atlantic trade as well, so you might know, for example, that the state of New York used to be called New Amsterdam, and Amsterdam, of course, is a city in the Dutch Republic, right? So they were pretty prominent everywhere, but especially in Asia. So in addition to being leaders in trade, they also had a really stable economy without much inflation, so they weren't really hit by the price revolution in the way that, say, Spain was. So it was pretty good for folks. Now, Amsterdam, which is a city in the Dutch Republic that I just mentioned, right? They were the financial center not only of the Dutch Republic, but also of Europe as a whole, right? So people everywhere put money in the Bank of Amsterdam. They participated in the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, where they bought, parts of joint stock companies. So it was really sort of the financial powerhouse of Europe, as well as the trading powerhouse of Europe during this time. And there's actually an interesting link here between the economic history of the Dutch Republic and the religious history, because one of the reasons why the Dutch were so economically successful is because of their religious toleration. So that religious toleration attracted a lot of Jewish merchants and Protestant merchants and skilled workers from both religions who had fled persecution in their own companies and found a home in the Dutch Republic. So these people fled persecution and then they came and they really contributed to the Dutch economy. Perhaps a hint to those of us in the present, too, who want to make our economy strong. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about religion. So as I mentioned, right, the Dutch Republic was Calvinist officially, but they they were relatively tolerant of both Jewish people and Catholics. So it's pretty unique in Europe, right? So we've mentioned that some countries are tolerant of various Christian groups, but we haven't really seen a country exercise a lot of religious tolerance for Jewish people yet. And this is actually a really, really important part of Dutch identity nowadays, actually. So there's this document called the Treaty of Utrecht, and it offers freedom of conscience. And a lot of Dutch people nowadays will talk about that, and they'll say, we need to still uphold this. This is part of our heritage. Now, in addition, the Dutch Republic, in addition to being tolerant of both Jewish people and Catholics, it also attracted a lot of Protestants who were fleeing persecution in majority Catholic countries. So it attracted Huguenots from France, and it actually attracted Puritans. We'll talk about them next lecture, but they were Calvinists who were experiencing or who did not like, shall we say, the Church of England. So we'll talk about them more next time. Now I've been hyping up the Dutch Republic's relative religious toleration, but I'm gonna put some weight on that word relative there, right? So it's not really religious toleration in the way we would think about it nowadays. So there were some limits here. So Jewish people and Catholics typically lived in like separate neighborhoods, so they didn't really live in the same neighborhoods as Protestant people, and the public displays of worship were limited. So what this means, right? So like if you were a Jewish person and you belonged to a synagogue, your synagogue kind of had to be on the down low. It was allowed to exist, but it couldn't like publicly advertise that it was a synagogue, right? So you kind of had to be in the know. So think about sort of what that implies there, right? And then even though people were allowed to practice their faith to an extent, right, Protestants still held all the positions of political power. So they were still the dominant force in the country. All right. So now I'm just going to briefly introduce art in the Dutch Republic. So this is one of the artistic movements that we're going to be looking at this unit, or really the artistic movement. And this movement is called Dutch Realism. And it's pretty similar to Northern Renaissance art, which of course we looked up back all the way in the first unit, because it developed out of Northern Renaissance art. But it's also got a few unique characteristics of its own. And this is what you guys are going to be researching the rest of today.